should this be? As high as that, you're taller. Is that doesn't do anything? Does that do something? No. Well, all right. Okay, could we start, please? I'm Parveen Adams, and I'm hosting the evening in the absence of Mark Cousins, who's in Spain. His apologies for not being here. His apologies for not giving his 5 o'clock lecture. He will do so next week before the invited speaker. As many of you know, this is a series that has now taken place over 3 years. And it is hosted by the Architectural Association, and it has the support of the London Consortium. I'm very grateful to the AA for asking me to organize them, and I'm very grateful to the London Consortium for supporting it financially. It's quite a short series this year. It's 4 speakers. I'm going to forget their names instantly. Today there's Bernd Behr, who had a recent installation in Chisenhale called House Without a Door, and he is mainly going to speak about that particular 16-minute film of his. I will introduce you at the end. I don't know how much else you want to know about him, except that he currently has 2 shows, one in Chelsea Art Space and one in Daniel Arnaud. And next week there'll be Ryan Gander, who is an extremely good and funny speaker, and he has lots of wonderful ideas, but as you'll see, his talk does touch on the reality of unfinished projects. And then on the 23rd, we have a young artist from Prague called Jan Mankuska. If you came to the first year of the series, you will have heard a Swede called Dahlström, who showed us a very amazing film, which we all took to be the camera moving through a model city, till a bird on a tree moved. And even then it was very hard to realize that actually it was a film taken at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Swedish summer night. It was a very, very astounding thing, which its relation to scale and models. Well, Jan Mankuska has worked with him and produced a show called an installation called The First Minute of the Rest of the Movie, which I'm sure he will talk about, as well as his very text-based work, which is of, I think, great architectural interest. And then finally, the 4th speaker is not an artist. He is Ralph Rugoff. He is the new director of the Hayward Gallery. He is an extremely accomplished speaker, and I have no idea what his title means, but it is A Brief History of Invisible Art, and that will be on the 9th of March. Okay, so I thank you all for coming, and Bernd, would you like to come up? Please welcome the speaker.
Thanks. Do you want to turn the lights on a bit? Okay. Hello? Okay. So first of all, thank you, Parveen, and the AA and the London Consortium for inviting me. I had different versions of this talk prepared, I think, and in the end decided that it'd be nicer perhaps to just take the time to explore one of the more recent works a bit further, but not perhaps giving up on the context of some of my earlier works and the current 2 works on show here in London to frame them. So, just as an introduction, perhaps as a prelude, I just want to briefly touch upon some earlier works to give you an idea of where I come from in terms of my thinking and in terms of my practice. My interest in the built environment, I think, has always been linked with an interest in the body. Specifically, perhaps the codependency between architecture and bodies. I've always been fascinated by this image, Yves Klein, the French artist, Leap into the Void, 1960. Never mind an early Photoshop exercise or darkroom kind of manipulated image. As a gesture, nevertheless, very, very eloquent. For me, though, what always kind of stood out in the various kind of anecdotal histories of this event was that the first attempt at leaping into the void, if you will, ended in a swollen ankle. This was at a different location, and he did it just by himself, and he landed quite awkwardly and twisted his ankle. And I think my attention immediately kind of went to that swollen ankle, thinking of it almost like a kind of sculptural moment, aftermath. And it enabled me to kind of think about this gesture more in relation to this kind of codependency, I suppose, and that this gesture, which is all about trying to escape the material world and embrace the void of the sky, really was only enabled by the material space it tried to denounce, if you like. So the idea that the material condition, in a sense, was built into or inscribed within that gesture, and therefore the gesture could never in itself kind of claim to be ultimately free of that. I did a video in 2001 called Théâtre du Vide, which was the subtitle of that photograph as Yves Klein published his own newspaper within which that image appeared. And essentially I managed to track down the location. It's in a suburb south of Paris called Fontenay-aux-Roses. And really I kind of went there just interested in, first of all, seeing the the place that this happened, something that's been kind of inscribed in that image, and to see if that location still exists and whether you could actually recognize it. And as you can see, perhaps the background, the train station is still there. The house that Klein originally jumped off from is no longer there. Strangely enough, there's a church there now, which you could just hear, and 2 concrete gate posts where the gate hasn't been installed yet. And really, with this work, I end up trying to engage, I suppose, physically with the architectural remnants of that gesture, of that leap into the void. And I think quite importantly for me, without resolve, without a kind of closure to perhaps the question that I came there with. Increasingly with later work, I became more interested in the body being sublimated into the built environment. And if there's any kind of anthropomorphic kind of projection going on, then I suppose it's one of the kind of the neuroses of the body being explored through the built environment. So this piece and the previous piece that was shown, they were both shown at the ICA, Beck's Futures in 2003, and I had about 6 of them lined up in the corridor on flat screens embedded in the walls. And for me, that was a really great moment to kind of explore perhaps a kind of relationship between the different videos, rather than seeing them as all kind of existing within their own self-contained kind of world, to see that they perhaps together created a cityscape where, you know, it was perhaps a cityscape driven more by compulsions or by through a body, perhaps a body out of control, a body larger than itself, or that it could contain itself. So that's just to kind of give a brief background in terms of kind of perhaps performance in a literal sense, and a development into a notion of architectural performativity, I suppose. And perhaps that's a term that I'll explore throughout this talk. Probably won't come to a conclusion, but at least it's something to kind of guide the way. So the exhibition at the Chisenhale Gallery last November was, in a sense, the kind of coming together of a project that had been going on for a year and a half. And it was great to have that opportunity to present this work in such a cavernous space, and also what I suppose Martin Kuma and Tamak called the spookiest gallery in town. It was a great opportunity to think about scale and presentation of video. I'd mostly been working on small scale, wanting to kind of avoid the kind of bombastic language of kind of, you know, ginormous video projections. But I think in this work, thinking about the nature of the content of the work, and thinking about what possibly the structure, the supporting structure for the screen could kind of bring to an understanding of the work. I'll leave that open, but that's something that I'd like to explore so further. But before I go into the work and into this body of research that really led up to the work coming together, I wanted to just give you a brief introduction to perhaps the context within this work developed. Okay, it's important to me to say that when I started or embarked on this project, I didn't know what its final form would be, and for that, in a sense, when I look back now to where it all started, I think that context played a big role in how the ideas developed. I did a residency with an organization called Center for Land Use Interpretation in Utah. Some of you might know CLUI. They're based in LA, but they've got sort of satellite spaces and projects going on in the California desert, in Utah, which is where the residency is. And more recently, they've opened a space in Troy, upstate New York. They sort of operate in this kind of strange no man's land between the art world and a kind of genuine research, geographical kind of society. A de-authored collective, if you like, an institutionalized extension of Robert Smithson. In their LA base, they do exhibitions and publications, and they organize tours of various military and industrial landscapes. Here's an image, for example, of an exhibition they did on the margins of Los Angeles. Their particular point of view, I'd say, is one that's very much is one that is looking at these military and industrial landscapes through a wry kind of land art historical prism, if you like. So this is an image of dumped concrete outside of Los Angeles. So back to Utah. The residency is in a small town called Wendover, which is literally on the state line between Utah and Nevada. It's sort of a glorified truck stop, really, on the I-80, Interstate 80, which runs from New York to San Francisco. And it's got a very peculiar, strange kind of dual identity, not only because the state line literally runs through the middle of it, and the one side, the Utah side, is rather poor and dilapidated, and the Nevada side, having the casinos, is rather rich. Here you can see the perhaps both the history and the present of Wendover in a single image. In the background you see the 24/7 casinos lighting up the desert sky, but in the front, remnants of Wendover's past, which was as an airbase and a training camp during World War II. And so these barracks, which by now are completely dilapidated, are sort of semi-squatted nowadays by a Latino community working mostly in the casinos. The military heritage of this site boasts one particular kind of gem. I use that word very carefully. It happens also to be the most dilapidated building in Wendover. It's the hangar that housed the Enola Gay during the Second World War. That's the bomber that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The town still celebrates, in a sense, its military heritage. Here you see an Independence Day parade float showing the Enola Gay coming out of its hangar. Perhaps because also it's so intermingled, intertwined with its own founding moment. Okay, so you're there in this absolutely magnificent desert. Wendover is just west of the Great Salt Flats, which in a sense is this dried up Jurassic lake called the Great Salt Lake. So a saline desert which is used, or has been used over the last couple of decades for land speed records. But what I think for me became more and more an unnerving experience now was that this image, or rather the landscape, was already inscribed within a sense of an image. This desert, this salt flats here, they're unnervingly familiar, and perhaps most of you are aware of or can remember car commercials being shot in absolutely pristine Arctic kind of conditions. They're probably filmed here. Now I wonder whether actually this idea of these car commercials being filmed there precisely because of wanting to frame their wares in this kind of existential image of just basically nothingness. And here with Anthony Hopkins dramatizing one of the characters made famous through the land speed records. It did have a very, very strange sense of stepping into something that was already established as an image. Many of the surviving military structures, such as the ammunition storage bunkers and warehouse structures, had already been usurped into the cultural canon by appearing in American photographers' Richard Misrach series Desert Cantos in the 80s. So, I'm not sure if you're aware of his body of work, but I knew these images, and there's a strange, incredibly strange sense of walking into something that, in a sense, had already been established as a kind of, as a legacy in a sense. This is graffiti probably during the 40s, made during the 40s, which she shot in the 80s, and stepping into it maybe 20 years later and having that sense of an image perhaps materialized, or a relationship between an image and a structure, and that relationship continuing rather than the image releasing the structure of its significance in a sense, because of it then securing its legacy. Equally, some of the structures themselves, even if seemingly in perfect harmony in age and style with its architectural context, would turn out to be, for example in this case, a film prop from the filming of Con Air, the Nicolas Cage vehicle. So the reason why I went to do the residency was, I suppose, through a coincidence really, because I was aware of CLUI and I was really interested in what they were doing. And at the same time I was researching a particular building that sits in the middle of the Utah desert. And it just so happened that really this was about 2 hours, a 2 hours drive south of the residency. So this is about, how far is this? I think about 90 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. And it's a building that sits in the middle of a military test site that's still active today, WWII Proving Grounds, about the size of Rhode Island. And this military test site is really, it's the home of this kind of architectural curiosity. It's a building that was built in 1943 by the US Army and Standard Oil. Standard Oil is the parent company of Exxon. Standard Oil were developing chemical and incendiary bombs, early forms of napalm, for example. And they decided, in order to increase their effectiveness towards the last years of the Second World War, in terms of bombing Nazi Germany, they decided they needed to recreate a replica of their targets. They commissioned Jewish emigre architect Erich Mendelsohn and Konrad Waxman to work as consultants on this project. And really what this was an exact replica of a typical German housing tract you would find in Berlin. Or perhaps not quite, because in many ways this was an architectural fiction, a compound of several styles, not least seen in the tile roof on the left, more representative of central and northern Germany, and the slate roof seen on the right, representative of housing in the Rhineland in western Germany. Also, it only had 2 stories, whereas their originals would be between 5 and 7 stories. And that's because the bombing would usually only affect the top 2 floors. And so it was decided it was pointless, obviously, to build the bottom 3 floors. So in a sense, it is a compressed compound of architectural vernaculars that it's trying to mimic. Erich Mendelsohn, I probably don't need to introduce here. He was known in Weimar circles in the 20s for his Einstein Tower just outside of Potsdam. This is from 1921. he was associated with a Circle of 10 group, which included Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe. And really Mendelssohn's trail of buildings in England, such as the Delaware Pavilion in Bexhill, Israel and USA, traces life in exile after fleeing the Nazi state in 1933. Mendelssohn first made a visit to the States in 1924, and on board the ship SS Deutschland he met Fritz Lang, here on the right, who was traveling with producer Erich Pommer on the left, to attend the New York premiere of Siegfried's Death, the first part of his epic treatment of the Germanic folk saga Nibelungen. It's in this film, Siegfried's Death, that we see an incineration of a full-scale plywood castle, Lang taking it upon himself to shoot the burning arrow that would ignite the spectacle, filmed simultaneously by 16 cameras. As so-called enemy aliens, both Mendelsohn, Pommer, and Lang were kept on the ship the first night after their arrival in New York. But it would prove to be another founding moment for Lang's capacity to kind of construct myths around his kind of working practice. In all subsequent interviews of his life, he would cement this by now mythologized, if factually incorrect, founding moment of his biggest film that ended up crippling the UFA. And UFA was the Uber studio active in Germany in the 20s and early 30s. So Lang says of his encounter with New York at night, "I first came to America briefly in 1924 and it made a great impression on me. The first evening when we arrived, we were still enemy aliens, so we couldn't leave the ship. It was docked somewhere on the west side of New York. I looked into the streets, glaring lights and tall buildings, and there I conceived Metropolis." Mendelssohn was equally haunted by the image of nocturnal New York. And he would write in his diary, "The ship turns Babylon, ghostly in the moonlit darkness, towering up in verticals of light. Rapid entry, turns, curves, a battle of space and the darkness, in the light of the embedded streets." Mendelssohn went to the States because he was responding to an invitation by Richard Neutra, his former colleague, who was now working with Frank Lloyd Wright. And upon his return, Mendelssohn published a book of his photographs, which he took on a trip, mostly on the East Coast, mostly in New York, simply called America. And it's particularly interesting that perhaps the book itself is full of unfinished skyscrapers, skeletons kind of rising into the sky. And they would have been clearly also the blueprints for Lang's vision of the future. Mendelssohn himself was no stranger to film. Here's the Universum Cinema of Berlin from 1928. Mendelssohn embraced the collapse of architectural space into cinematic screen in his inaugural speech at the opening of the cinema in 1928. He says, "All surfaces, curves, orchestral pit and ceiling lights rush towards the screen, through the medium of music into the flickering image, into the universum." German film in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s was rife with doppelgangers. This is an early film that would, in retrospect, count as one of the kind of starting points of German expressionist cinema. It was refilmed about 2 or 3 times at a later point again. We see here Konrad Veidt and Werner Krauss dramatizing the kind of archetypal narrative of the doppelganger in the film Student of Prague. Dr. Caligari being, of course, the most famous representative of that genre, even giving that whole kind of movement its name in France. I was particularly interested in looking at this, how the sets, the architectural sets, in a sense would take on the central role in these films, narrating not only the psychological dimensions of the characters, but really kind of being put forward as one of the stars of these movies. So when I finally managed to gain access to the test site and visit German Village, there was a moment where it seemed to all kind of collapse in a sense, not the building, but my project there. Now, mind you, by this point, I still wasn't sure what this project was, and I think that's, for me, it's become more and more, I suppose, the kind of process that I'm interested in, and it's to do with starting to engage with a particular site and its history, and perhaps its kind of extensions of where certain kind of links lead to, and allowing those then, in retrospect, allowing those to construct the kind of trajectory of how a project might evolve. So I was told by the woman who guided me through the test site, and mind you, it was about a half an hour drive from the entrance to the test site, that I could see the building from the outside, but I wouldn't be allowed to go and see the interior of the building because it's structurally unsafe, perhaps also because it's been used for SWAT training exercises, and that'd be unsightly bullet-ridden mannequins, and you never know. But really the linchpin of the project appeared then when I found this place, literally a crossroads. It's got two farms there, about 30, 40 miles west of WWII Proving Ground. And so in a way, the fact that I couldn't enter the building and see its interior, and the reference to Faust, which again kind of brought me back to Weimar, Germany, enabled me to think of this project as possibly a way or a proposal to fictionalize the interior of this building as a way of approaching it, as a way of engaging with it, but fictionalizing it precisely through some of these references that the building itself provided. Faust is, of course, the German folk tale, retold by many, including Goethe and Murnau. Here we've got Faust City from 1931 at the Salzburg Festival. Faust was there, directed by Max Reinhardt, and Max Reinhardt being the kind of theatre impresario in the 20s in Germany, one of the kind of founding people of expressionist theatre. Faust was also a film done by Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau in 1924. This is a production still. And again, the appearance of an intricate model village playing, again, a very, very central role to the narrative. Incidentally, there was an anecdote from the filming of this where Emil Jannings, the actor playing Mephisto, is dangling above the paper village on the scaffold. The director having forgotten that Emil Jannings suffers terribly from vertigo, and Jannings trembling and sweating, and his sweat invariably raining down onto the paper village. Another film from the 20s that would cement the identity of German expressionist cinema was The Golem. And here you see the sets designed by Hans Pölzig. Hans Pölzig himself was an architect in every way. He designed the home of Max Reinhardt, which is the Große Schauspielhaus in Berlin, the big theater of Berlin, in a very Gothic style, as you can see. Hans Pölzig himself never made it to America, but his name did. One of his students in Berlin ended up making that jump, making the trip across to Hollywood quite early on in the 20s, in fact, producing very slick horror films for that time. This is The Black Cat, a still from The Black Cat, starring Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. The architect, the character, which Boris Karloff plays in this film, is the architect who builds himself this modernist castle on top of a World War I grave, a cemetery. Anyway, sorry, where am I going? So, Fritz Lang was amongst those who ended up leaving Germany for Hollywood, like many of his colleagues in the film world and all other arts. Many of them even leaving before the rise of the Nazis, simply for economic reasons in the 20s. Fritz Lang himself left, again in one of his kind of mythologized stories, the day after he was offered the job as the kind of the chief of film under the Nazis, because they liked Metropolis so much. Here he is looking at a maquette for Hangman Also Die, which was a film where he collaborated with Bertolt Brecht on the script. Now, I suppose I've kept this for this point, not because I'm trying to keep things from you, but really to kind of perhaps show the cyclical nature of the research, the loop that was sort of embedded in what I was coming across. German Village was commissioned, or Erich Mendelsohn and Konrad Wachsmann were commissioned to design German Village, but the interior had to be authenticated by a Hollywood studio. And that was RKO Radio Pictures. And RKO was, of course, the home of Orson Welles. Here looking at a maquette for The Magnificent Amazons, a film shot just the year before German Village was constructed. But it's perhaps more the fact that RKO were shooting Hitler's Children in 1943 that they got the job of authenticating the interior of the building. Now, German Village originally was part of a larger complex representing both fronts that the states were fighting on, or in military speak, the European Pacific Theatre, and equally RKO were releasing Hitler's Children and Beyond the Rising Sun in 1943. Now there's nothing left of the Japanese village, which was the immediate neighbor of this architectural fiction, there, simply because that was all built out of wood and paper. Now, German village itself becomes, for me, this kind of residue of a moment when something was built in a very, very performative gesture. A structure built to demonstrate its own destruction, in a sense. And I can only imagine how, from an observation, a concrete observation bunker at a safe distance away, test officers would observe the repeated, clinically staged bombings. So the building would be bombed, rebuilt, bombed and rebuilt at least 3 times. But the test officers would watch this going on through the slits of the bunker in a kind of letterbox framing, as if to kind of short-circuit the distance between them and the Hollywood interior of this structure. So I thought I'd show you a little bit of the film. I have to put it in, sorry. So I want to just want to show you. In fact, I'll actually show the complete film, and then after that, just briefly touch upon the 2 other works that are currently showing here in London.